Hi and hello watch fans, and welcome to another edition of the Real Time Show. Today I am joined by a guest who I've never met in real life and will be learning about on air along with all of you, my dear listeners. This is Simon Jeeves calling in from Liechtenstein, of all places. That's the first time we've ever had a guest from Liechtenstein. Welcome, Simon.
Well, thanks for having me.
So you were recommended to me, you've come very highly recommended actually, from a dear friend of the show, Marie Ansel of 289 Consulting. And she said that we simply had to get to know each other. So we're going to get to know each other, hopefully a little better over the next 45 minutes or an hour. Perhaps you could start by telling us who you are, what you're doing in Liechtenstein, and why Marie thinks so highly of you.
Well, that's actually quite a funny story. But let me begin with why I actually got to meet Marie in the first place. So I studied at the University of St. Gallen, and I'm in the board of the Watch Club there. So we had an event in Lucerne that we didn't have enough people to go to, actually. So I was asked if I could come along. So I went, and was a nice event. I had a bit of wine, maybe a bit too much. And so towards the end of the presentation that they gave, I saw Marie was talking to somebody about the GPHG awards, and I'm quite opinionated as always. So I thought I'd chime in, and that's really how we got to talking. I had a few very I suppose good opinions. She would have thoughts about the watches that they were looking at, and she for some reason asked me if I wanted to come onto a podcast, and I thought, okay, it's nothing I've ever done before. I suppose that's something I would like to do, and so really through the Watch Club at the university, I got to talking to Marie, and that's how I was introduced to you.
Very good. Well, I like to hear that you're opinionated, because perhaps you could share some of those opinions on air. We did a 2-part breakdown of the GPHG Awards this year, and we had some strong opinions of our own that were flying about. But why don't you tell me first what your relationship with watchmaking is exactly? You're a student, I take it.
Yeah. So I got into watches a couple of years ago when I was still in high school. Just a friend of mine got into it, and I didn't really have much of an interest in it before. I just sort of knew about it through my grandfather, because he was like the first person whose watch I really noticed. But that's really all I knew. I just knew there was Rolex and a few of the obvious brands, but I didn't really know much about watches at all. So this friend got me into it, and actually initially because I thought, well, if I was looking at used watches, maybe I could get a better deal. So that is how I got into vintage Rolex when I was 17. Late 16, we're about to turn 17. And so that was sort of my main thing for a while, and just consumed as much content as possible. And that was my sort of main domain. And after that, I suppose modern watches haven't really interested me as much as vintage has. So I thought, okay, if I could find a good Datejust, right, a vintage one, because I really like the way they looked. And I just looked at all the stuff I could find on the internet. And I got to YouTube, consuming the regular watch content that you might find on there. And that sort of developed, sort of broadened my horizons. I just got into the obvious watch journalism. I looked at all the Hodinkee videos. I really took a liking to the Reference Point series. And then I got into independence, which is the thing I probably care about most at the moment. So I suppose it started when I was younger. Started with Rolex, as opposed it has for many other people, and then sort of moved into more contemporary watches, and now primarily independent watches that I care for.
So what are you studying?
I study business, so I'm about to finish. So I've had a focus on finance.
I see. So you could be teeing yourself up for a fine and long and probably rather lucrative career in the watch industry at this rate.
I suppose it depends. I've thought about this before, and I've had a talk about it, but I'm honestly not quite sure if I would actually work in the industry. Maybe. I always saw myself more as a customer, I suppose.
Okay, so tell me this. How old are you now?
I'm 22 at the moment.
Okay, so your journey in watches has been around 6 years. Not quite, but around
roughly, yeah.
Okay, this is amazing. I think you might be the youngest guest we've had on the show. We've had Jean-Claude Biver, who is, I believe, 74 at the time of recording, and you at 22. So we've got a 52-year delta, which is, this is why it's the Real Time Show, right? Because it's about all things to do with watchmaking. It's very, very interesting for me to talk to somebody at the start of their collecting career. Okay, you're only 22. You've got 6 years under your belt already, which is not an insignificant amount of time, and you're not in the industry yet and don't necessarily plan to be, you assume that you'll be a lifelong collector and appreciator of watches. And already at 22, you're into independent watches. So let's get back to that GPHG subject and let's talk a little bit about some of the pieces that really impressed you and some of the pieces that I hope horrified you, because I want to hear some negative opinions as well.
I haven't seen the award show itself, unfortunately, but because I've been quite busy as of late. But what we got talking about was in particular Nomos, because I believe Nomos was nominated. And that's something I felt quite strongly about, because Nomos had, I think, they discontinued the best watch that they had on offer. That was the club in 37mm with the pneumatic movement. That is what I was most opinionated about, to be honest, because I was quite saddened when I realized that they discontinued it. They now only offer the bigger version, I think 41.5mm with the movement. So that's what I was most shocked by, I suppose, and that might have been what impressed Marie that much.
Very interesting that you bring that up. I mean, Nomos has just released a new series of mid-sized clubs in 39.5mm, so that might go some way towards healing that wound. But I agree that 37mm pneumatic clubs were a beautiful Goldilocks size in the club collection. I have the 36 myself. I do have a 38 somewhere as well. I prefer the 36, but I thought if only they did the 37 in what I wanted to see was a manual wind version. Now, I am going to propose to Nomos that that's the real-time show Nomos collaboration, a 37mm club using the manual movement from before. But what was it you liked about that pneumatic movement in that case? Was it the movement that mostly attracted you, or was it that sweet spot size?
So I think it's more than just one thing. So I really like the pneumatic movement. I think it's incredible how thin it is and how nice it looks. And this all plays into how expensive the watch is, because I think it used to be a fantastic price point. So you get a very thin automatic movement. That looks great in my opinion. And I think the dial is fantastic in that size. The proportion of the sub-seconds to everything that is on the dial, I think is fantastic. And I myself am not huge on the California dial. I much prefer it if I just have one sort of numeral. And I believe every one they do now has the Roman numerals at the bottom, which I'm not a huge fan of. So having the option to have all the same numerals, automatic movement, with proper spacing around the dial, which is something I don't like about 41.5, because that's essentially the same movement as far as I'm concerned. Just a bigger watch, so there's a date window beneath the sub-second, which I think just throws off the balance completely. So really, I believe the 37mm one was perfect. I think it was probably my favorite Nomos ever.
Well, that's quite a statement. And it's totally fine that if that is your true opinion, that's the one you hold. It's quite a niche opinion. Obviously, Nomos's decision to discontinue it backs that up. I think part of the problem with the 37mm line, if there is such a thing, is perhaps it never had enough, shall we say, daily dial colors. There was the signal blue and the signal red, or siren red and siren blue, if you prefer, that were released in the 2017 Aqua collection. And they were quite striking colours, and certainly not for everyone, although I do believe that the red one in particular will be viewed as a classic as time goes on. And then they had a white dial, like a gloss white dial with red and blue accents. Also nice, but not quite as wearable as some of the matte silvered dials that you find in the 36s and the 39s and so on and so forth. I've got good news for you, though. Nomos has brought back a club into the collection that has all Arabic numerals. They've revamped the original 701 this year, just released it in October, and it's absolutely glorious. Unfortunately, 36mm. So if you could speak to Nomos, because you can speak to Nomos through this podcast, because they're just down the road from where I live, what would you like them to do? 37mm, pneumatic movement, all Arabic numerals, but what dial colours would appeal to you?
Well, I'm quite partial to the white, honestly, the white with the red accents, or reddish blue accents, the one you talked about, the signal white, I believe they called it. I thought that was quite brilliant. If they did that with a matte dial, like a matte white, I suppose many people would think that matte white is a bit boring, but I think matte white is fantastic. I generally just like matte dials. So I think if they could do it matte white with the same color scheme, I think that would be quite the winner. I suppose 36mm case size would be fine by me. I mean, so long as they fit the pneumatic movement in it, that's for me the most important part, really. for all of those elements to come together.
Very interesting. So the neomatic movement really does stand as something that you're very interested in. Is that because you prefer automatic movements in general, or do you just find that particular creation by Nomos very beguiling?
I think it's just a great value for money, honestly. I mean, you get a really thin watch with a movement, and I suppose for most people, automatic is the most convenient one. And I personally don't really mind. Earlier last year, I got my first manual wind watch, and honestly, I don't mind it personally, but I see how that might be a problem for other people.
If you don't mind, can you tell us what watches you currently have in your collection so we can get an idea of where your collecting habits might be pointing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I initially got interested in vintage Rolex. That is also the first watch that I bought myself. I bought a 36mm Rolex Datejust from 1978 with a matte grey dial with gold accents. Really interesting story behind that, but I'll elaborate on that later. I have an IWC pilot chronograph that I got for my high school graduation. And earlier last year, I bought a Cartier Basculante.
So you've got quite a variety already in a relatively small collection. What's next on the list?
Well, that's the thing. I said I'm quite opinionated, so it really takes a lot for me to actually like something, enough to buy it, that is. There's plenty of things I like, but liking something and wanting to buy it, for me, is at least very, very different. So at the moment, I honestly have no idea. At least within a reasonable price range. Of course, I'd obviously be down for a Smith, but not like I could buy or afford one. Something that I really like that's more affordable is Harbring. Fortunately, I don't like the designs they usually make, but the collaborations I think are quite brilliant. So either I can maybe in the future, when I have the funds available and they bring out a new collaboration that I like, that would be brilliant. With Deadbeat Second complication. Sort of my favorite complication, I might say. So that's really the only thing I could think of. Not much on the radar at the moment that I would buy in the future, at least as of now.
Do we think a Deadbeat Seconds qualifies as a complication? What do you define a complication as?
Well, I suppose the thing that a lot of people go by is that anything that is more than a sub-second is a complication. So a central second could be a complication, I suppose. But I think that's a bit silly. I mean, a second's hand is a second's hand. But I mean, a deadbeat complication, I think it's quite a lot. So I suppose I would define a complication as anything that adds more to the regular timekeeping.
Okay.
Of the regular mechanism, that is.
Okay, well, halfway through that definition, I was in agreement with you, but I'm interested because obviously definitions change over time, and you're of a different generation from me, so I'm curious as to see how the word complication is being applied by younger collectors. Because, for example, a lot of people call a tourbillon a complication. Technically speaking, it isn't, in the same way that a Deadbeat Seconds probably isn't, even though it's a very complicated mechanism to add to a movement. It isn't a complication because it doesn't add a function to the timekeeping, to the base timekeeping. So even something as mundane as date is a complication, whereas a Deadbeat Seconds, which is far more difficult to execute, technically, I guess, in the old world, isn't. But what do you feel about that? Do you think that it's okay for definitions to evolve and just be used as people use them rather than how they were originally conceived to be used?
That's actually really interesting. I've never heard about anybody talk about tourbillon that way. But I suppose it's the tourbillon just makes timekeeping more accurate, whereas Deadbeat Seconds would allow you to read the time more accurately. So I suppose that might be a complication if you have a use for a ticking seconds hand. But coming back to how you talked about the definitions changing, suppose as long as there's enough people in agreement, right? Because the only reason you would use those definitions is to more efficiently communicate your opinions to another person. So as long as enough people know what it is that you're talking about, I think it's okay.
That's a very nicely reasoned point, actually, but it takes us into the realms of linguistic analysis, even further away from watchmaking, because, of course, language is always changing, right? And people agree upon words meaning certain things, and you very accurately, and I 100% agree with you here, said it's about communicating your meaning most effectively and most accurately. So yeah, if the majority of people suddenly decided that a tourbillon was a complication, or that the words blobber squab meant a particular type of dial printing, then that's fine. That would become a word eventually, and we would all go around talking about blobber squab dials, which hopefully won't happen. Maybe it'll catch on now we've said it on the Real Time Show. Please don't pick up on that, members of the network. I was only joking. But it is interesting because there does come a point, and I was having a conversation with my best friend who's a linguist himself about exactly this, the evolution of language and terminology. And he was very much in support of your position, that language evolves and it changes, and those of us stuck in the past need to unstick our feet from the mud and just move with the times. However, I said to him, it's all well and good to break a convention or to create a neologism that refers back to a conventional term, a widely accepted term, a term that's been used for many generations, as long as you know the root of that term, because you can use whatever words you want amongst your cohort to communicate things. That's fine. But if the meaning of a complication, for example, specific example, because we're talking about it, was lost, then you get further and further and further away from the actual descriptive power of those words. And so, not to stick too much to my guns, but I think that's why I still, even now when I write articles about bicompax chronographs, I labor this point that what people describe as a bicompax chronograph now, like generally, I don't know, you tell me, what do you think a bicompax chronograph is?
Oh, okay, this might be very embarrassing because, to be fair, I never really thought about it too much. But whenever I see a bicompax chronograph, it usually is a chronograph that measures up to 30 minutes because it only has one subdial along with the second subdial.
Right, perfect. That's exactly what people refer to as a bicompax. So it's a chronograph that has two subdials on the dial, right? And those subdials can be arranged either horizontally or vertically, so either at 3 and 9 or at 12 and 6. People would say nowadays that's a bicompax chronograph. However, the word bicompax is kind of a modern corruption of the old terminology that referred to subdials displaying information that was delivered by the complication itself. So a traditional layout that had a single subdial linked to the chronograph, as you rightly pointed out, and a second subdial would actually be called either a compare or a unicompax. The seconds was completely disregarded. And then you would have a dial that had 3 subdials on it, and even if one of those was a seconds and the other 2 were, say, a minute counter and an hour counter linked to the chronograph, that was not referred to as a bicompax, simply as a compax layout. That was the standard one, which I think was started by Universal Genève in like the 50s or the 60s. And then a tricompax, which nowadays people would think is actually a compax, actually had 4 subdials, where the 4th subdial often displayed the date. It could display something else theoretically, but it was often the date as an additional complication. So now people have seen the term compax and the term tricompax, and they've retroactively made twin subdial watches bicompax watches, even though bicompax was never even a word. But it works, right? Because you know what it means. Like when I say to you what's a bicompax chronograph, you instantly have a vision in your mind of the kind of watch I'm describing. So perhaps it's valid, and perhaps I'm just out of time and I need to change my mind.
It's actually interesting because I never really thought about it this way. But now that I think about it, the only reason I really thought about whatever compax was because I was looking at Universal Genève's on Chrono at some point. And I believe that is where I know that from. So tricompax, I immediately thought about their annual calendar.
Right.
A chronograph with the 4 subdials. So they wouldn't have thought of a regular one of 3 subdials. It's a good point. I suppose it really depends, right? If at the moment, how far back do you want to go for a connection to really make sense anymore? If today everybody calls a chronograph of 2 subdials a bicompax, I'm not entirely sure that the best course of action would be to correct everybody to point out that, well, in fact, that's not how it used to be back in the 50s. Because that's probably just not going to catch on, right?
No, you're absolutely right. And don't worry, I never do it in real life. I would never interrupt the flow of a conversation to correct somebody over something like that. Because, as you accurately said, as long as their meaning is communicated, there's no need to be that pedantic about it. My concern simply with this particular example, and also language in general, is that if we do float too far away from root words and meanings, then we can't keep making words that relate to things that relate to other things that relate to other things. Maybe we can. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I look at the way people write text messages and the way that words are shortened and vowels are, optional these days, it would seem. You can just take them out and people still can read the words and the message can be communicated. But what if everybody forgot what vowels were? What would happen then? Anyway, look, I tell you what, I've got a task for you, some homework. Go back to your peers and just ask them if they think about it. Ask them if they realize what the terms are, where they come from, and discuss whether or not it's important or not. And then come back and tell me that I'm crazy and tell me that it's totally unimportant and I should just get over it and just roll with the times.
I mean, you pointed out that you think it's important to have sort of a connection to what the term used to mean in the past. And I think if you extend it to your example of the bicompax chronograph, it sort of has a connection, right? It's not completely unconnected of what it was before. It just now describes something that's slightly different. So it's not like you're calling a rhinoceros a chronograph, right? It's that, I mean, there's different species of rhinoceroses. You might, call those something else that is within the species. So if you describe a chronograph as something that used to be slightly different, but maybe that complication doesn't make sense in the way it used to anymore these days, I suppose it's not completely inaccurate. There would still be a connection to the past, right? So people would still have an idea what it is that you're talking about.
I guess I don't have a problem with terms being used. However, they need to be used to communicate meaning. I suppose what I have an issue with is when the term is being used by somebody that doesn't understand the corruption of it, because that can get tricky. Because you say it's not referring to what it referred to in the past. The chronographs themselves, they haven't changed. It's just the way to refer to them. Like the chronograph that would previously have been a compa or a unicompax still exists. It's just called something different now because people have hijacked a term and slightly misappropriated it, not understanding that the seconds subdial can be discounted. And yeah, that's okay in terms of chatting about it. Absolutely. But I just wonder what's next. Is a tricompax dial going to become a bicompax or a double bicompax? And maybe it doesn't matter. But it's just, we're talking about a pretty limited period of history here. It's not as convoluted a discussion as it is when it comes to language. And it's not as widely used as language in general. It's only 300 years of history. And really the stuff we're talking about is 100 years, not even that really. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting just to hear the generational differences of opinion, because your opinion is going to be far more important than mine in 50 years time. So that's why I'm curious. And I figured I might as well take the opportunity to ask somebody who is going to be, leading the charge of the next generation when I'm 6 feet under, I guess. So tell me about this story behind your date, Just. I'm curious because it sounds like an interesting model that you chose for yourself.
So I got looking initially, and then I sort of focused on what I would find on forums to sort of know what I'm looking for, because I knew I obviously wanted to try and make sure, even though it was Chrono, that I wouldn't buy a fake and have to go through the trouble of sending it back to try and get my money back. So I was looking through a lot, and obviously to anybody that knows anything about it, I suppose you could divide vintage date chests, the second generation 4 digits, into two camps, right? You get quickset or you don't get quickset. And then the Rolex text is slightly higher up on the quickset or slightly lower down, depends. And the hours hand is longer on the quicksets. And you lose the pipe hand dial you had with the no quickset date chests. And I pretty quickly realized that I very much like the pipe hand dial, so I knew it would be something that's before 1979 or so, because that gets a bit dicey around that area, that point in time, when they sort of switched over to quicksets. So I sort of had an idea what I was looking for. And I also knew that being in Liechtenstein, sort of Switzerland, when it comes to buying watches, it's basically the same. I wouldn't want it to be too far away, just because of import duties and so on. So I just kept an eye out on Chrono and just filtered out to things I wasn't so interested in. That was just the silver dials, because those are the most plentiful, really. But it didn't really interest me that much. And so I also knew I wanted to have one with a bracelet, because I knew that would be quite expensive to get after the fact. And I'd imagine it's probably not going to get much easier to buy one in reasonable condition. So those are sort of the criteria I was looking for. And I was looking for a couple of months, and there it pops up on Chrono in Switzerland. This watch, the Datejust with a bracelet that looked to be in okay condition, with a matte, sort of matte dark grey dial with gold accents. And I thought, okay, that's weird. Gold accents on a steel Datejust, it's a bit odd. You usually know what you see on a 1603, especially. So I thought, okay, it's probably not going to be original to the watch. And then I got to looking around to see if I could find a dial on a different configuration. So I found one that is sort of similar in a 16013, so the two-tone Datejust. And I thought, okay, could very well be that this is not original to the watch, but I just really, really liked it. Because while I was looking, I found a lot of matte dial Datejusts. And I frankly love those very much. But there weren't many black ones around, and I couldn't find a black one with a bracelet for a reasonable price. So I found this one, and it's got this really warm hue to it. It's a bit like if you look at the Black Bay 58, the black version with the gilt accents. Has a similar look, I suppose. So I really like that one, and I thought, okay, I think I might just take the gamble, because I found some. I found 3 other ones with the same, so 1603s, same dial. And all of them were from 1977 or 1978. So I thought, okay, interesting. If it's a Franken watch, I've at least not found any other. The only other ones I've found would have been from the same time period. So I thought, okay, that's good enough for me. I think I'll buy that one. And so I decided to meet up with this guy in Zurich, and I look for a shop to hand over the watch, because I was a bit younger and I didn't want to get robbed, obviously, because I had it with me cash. So we were looking for a shop. Turns out watch shops don't want you buying somebody else's watch in their store, even if you were to pay them to have a look at the watch. So that was a bit stressful, but we got to some small watchmaker along Bahnhofstrasse. That's where we transacted, and that's where I got my watch. But before going into the shop, because we was there a bit early, before the other guy showed up, this old man was standing in front of the shop, looking inside, and he looks to me and he says, "You should buy a Swiss watch because it's going to last a lifetime." And I was like, "Wow, this is like a commercial, right? This is ridiculous because I'm about to buy a watch myself." So I go in, everything goes smoothly. I get my watch, and I've had it ever since. So I'm still not quite sure if it's original that way, but the lume on it looks to be fine. I mean, everything checks out. So I suppose if anything's been swapped, it might have only been the date disc and the dial. But that's sort of the story of my Datejust. That's got me looking in all sort of nooks and crannies around the internet. So I've probably seen every search result that you can get for 1603 matte grey dial.
I can imagine, yeah. I mean, do you mind me asking how much you paid for that watch?
I paid 3,800.
Oh, that's very good. Now, where was that? That was 5 or 6 years ago.
That was 5 years ago. So it was reasonable, I suppose.
Must have had one hell of a paper round to afford that at 17. I'm impressed. How the hell did you learn so much about specifically Rolex Datejust? I don't know if your level of expertise extends to other watches. I mean, feel free to wow me if it does. But was this just from reading online, or did you go and mine through local libraries, contact local retailers, contact Rolex even for like old catalogs and technical information? How did you come by all this information?
No, I just looked around online, and a lot of the things I just noticed myself. So, for example, the thing of the hand length. It's an easy way to differentiate between quick set and non-quick set. It's something I just noticed by looking at them. Because I, for some reason, was really paranoid. I thought, okay, what if this is a reprint? Because it really bothered me if it were. So I thought, okay, let's look at this really, really closely. Whatever I can see on the dial, I just try and see if anything's off. And that's sort of how I got to noticing these things. And it's just online, really. So I watch most YouTube videos I can find, which don't go into that much depth. That's why I thought of actually writing something about it myself, because I couldn't find a lot about it. So the old Rolex history just mainly concerns, the Daytonas and to Submariners and so on, but not really Datejusts in particular in such depth. But no, it's just forum posts looking for things. I think I posted once or twice to see what other people thought about it. Didn't really get too much of valued input, but I was trying to compare reference numbers. I mean, it's quite accessible online. That wasn't so bad. So I tried to see, okay, is my serial number fine with this year? and there's the movement match this year. So my Datejust, for instance, would have been right as they transitioned. So I suppose maybe the person who bought my Datejust initially might have gotten a discount on it, because it was right there around that time where they switched to quickset movements. So I suppose that might have been on sale. I think I forgot his name, unfortunately, but the guy who owns Bayer at the moment, when he bought his first Rolex, he also bought. I think he had the option to buy a 1019 that was on sale because they were about to phase them out, or buy an Oyster Quartz. That's why he bought the Oyster Quartz, because he thought that looks cool, and the other one's on its way out. So yeah, no, just mainly online.
I was going to suggest writing something yourself, documenting your experiences and compiling all of this information that I don't know, perhaps it exists mostly in your head, on paper or on the screen at least, for other people going through the same, well, minefield, as it were, to discover something like you discovered. Very, very impressive indeed. I'm quite fascinated to know, do you apply the same level of diligence to other models, either in the Rolex catalogue or outside of it? Or is that what you're going through now as you start to become more interested in independent brands?
Really, if I buy something, I want to know what I'm buying, right? So when I got my Cartier earlier last year, I sort of knew I wanted to get a Basculin at some point because I just really liked it, and I thought it was quite special. So I found this randomly. Somebody sent it to me. Maybe you know the page Rare Birds on Instagram. I followed them because they post interesting watches. So I see it come up, and I thought, oh, I really like this, right? And compared to Chrono, at least, it's a great price, and it's also got some interesting backstory which relates to me in a way. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to buy a Basculin, it's got to be this one. And so I tried to figure out as much as possible as I could about the modern Basculins, to know what I'm getting, to see, if it's a good deal or not. And luckily, it's a bit easier than buying vintage Rolex because it's sort of straightforward. But I, noticed all the things that I liked about it. And then I thought, okay, this seems like a reasonable deal. And because I should point out, the watch was engraved 2001 Cartier, and that's my birth year. So I thought that's pretty cool. If I'm going to get one, seems like one to get. But obviously, if it's just an aftermarket engraving, it doesn't really add that much value. So I got to looking as well, and I thought, okay, if this is actually something that relates to Cartier, that could be really cool, because it's not the Millennium Edition that they had for 2000 for the 2000s. I think they made like 365, but it was something that wasn't too well documented. So I'm not entirely sure why it is, but I suppose I have two possible explanations for the Cartier 2001 engraving. One is allegedly that the Cartier is still open somewhere in France, and for that opening, they sold the watches engraved with the year it opened in. It's a bit odd. And apparently, another thing that might have been the case is that they opened a new factory in La Chaux-de-Fonds, I believe, in 2001. And for the first couple that they made, well, it would have been hundreds, I suppose, but the first batch that they made of the Basculin, they would have engraved with Cartier 2001 to commemorate them opening a new factory. So that's pretty cool. So I from what I understand, it certainly is original from Cartier. So I have a Basculin, which is pretty much the same as every other mechanical Basculin that you can get, but it's got something special that relates to me. So I suppose what I really value is, especially if I buy something that's older, is to better understand its history and see how that connects, how I can connect with that history.
You seem to be followed around by an almost fatalistic touch. I mean, the old man outside the shop and now the Cartier with your birth year on the back. I mean, it's pretty special and pretty nice stories to have, like with that's 2/3 of your 3-watch collection that you listed before. Let's just touch on the third one before I ask my next probing question into your in-depth research into the past of these watches. Is there anything special about the third one?
Well, that's one I got for graduation. So in that sense, it is very special to me. And I suppose something that I have with my watches is that I feel like it communicates a sort of feeling, right? I don't want to say vibe. It's a bit too Gen Z for me. But with the IWC, it feels like it's a very rugged thing, right? So when I put on the IWC, it feels like I'm gonna, go out in a plane, backcountry, and explore, do something interesting. But obviously, the watch itself is just a serial production. There's nothing too special about it other than that I like it very much, and that it is very, very, very different from my other two watches because it's 43 millimeters and it's about 15.5 millimeters thick. It's basically the opposite of the Cartier.
Well, it's good to have variety. Variety is the spice of life, after all. Now, you just made what I would assume was a slightly derogatory passing comment about Gen Z, but you are bang slap in the middle of Gen Z, right? So this is your generation. I'm right in that, right? It's the 90s, 2010s.
I believe so, yes.
But do you see yourself then, how I interpret your comment is that you see yourself as a slightly older soul and you're not really buying into all this like newfangled language?
No, it's just I feel like language is dumbed down a lot. It's just like when people use like 50 times in a sentence. It's not that it's something that I have a problem with. It's just something that I try to avoid myself because it's not really using a good word to describe. It's just sort of a crutch in a way. So if you can't come up with a different sentence structure, you just use like, or if you need time to think, you say like, or if you don't know how to describe something, you say vibe. It's not something I try to use, I suppose. It's like English words in German. I try to avoid it as well.
Oh, I try to lean on those all the time. It certainly helps me in Germany. Thankfully, I was absolutely amazed when I learned that the Germans use the verb to struggle, just like struggle, and then they, conjugate it, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Interesting, though. So other than the laziness or misuse of language that proliferates amongst your generation, and mine as well, by the way, it's not a new thing. That I think I'm a millennial, or I'd like to think of myself as a zennial, but yeah, somewhere between the two. Besides that, would you regard yourself as like relatively typical for your generation? I mean, you're right bang in the middle of this generational cohort that people describe. I'm asking because I want to know what the watch industry is doing right and doing wrong for Gen Z, because you're one of the first members of your generation to be an active watch buyer, to have a collection, certainly to have the level of knowledge that you have. You're one of the youngest people on the planet to have those tools already. So I am interested, like in terms of communication strategy. You see what I did there? Like I just dropped it in there for you. So in terms of communication strategy, is it working? Do watch brands have a handle on what Gen Z want? And you don't have to anoint yourself a spokesperson for your entire generation, but just as your personal opinion, does it speak to you?
Yeah, I was about to point out the range I think is quite extensive. If I think about that, my younger brother, who's about 10 years younger, is pretty much in the same generation as I am, and I'm very much very different from him. And when it comes to marketing materials, I'm not entirely sure if they all work as well as they probably want them to. I don't really feel spoken to very much, but then again, I'm not huge on marketing of watches in particular to begin with. I don't feel like it would normally sway me to buy something. Although I must say, I always commend IWC for their marketing because I think it's fantastic. As you probably noticed earlier when I put on the IWC, I feel like I'm going to go out and fly plane into the backcountry. That's very much what they want to communicate with their brand, and that model line in particular. But I think generally, I suppose it's very difficult to market to watch. And all the celebrities' endorsement, I think, a bit silly and a waste of money. But then again, I suppose they might work for some people. So some people might actually think a watch is interesting because the person that they like also wears it. It's not really something that is for me. So I suppose the most effective way has always been to try and communicate sort of feeling that is associated with ownership. And I don't think that would be very much... that wouldn't differ so much from what they've been doing for the last 20 years. But I would assume that maybe the customer base is getting a bit younger, or they want to capitalize more on the younger customer base. But I think through collaborations, probably not going to be the way to go.
Interesting. I think you're absolutely right that the goal is to communicate a feeling that you will hopefully experience when you own said watch. Marketing is all about the mode of communication, though. Now, it can be brand ambassadors, which doesn't seem to appeal to you. It could be a more technical approach. It could be putting the watches in the hands of specific influencers that aren't necessarily celebrities themselves, but maybe people that have tangential interest to watchmaking, like mechanics, race car drivers, know their stuff, pilots maybe. I also felt for a long time that marketing wasn't really targeted at me. or for me or something I was susceptible to. And I was certainly wrong on the latter point. I just didn't realize that I was being marketed to in ways I didn't identify as marketing. So every shred of brand communication through whichever channel it comes is generally considered and is, I suppose, hoped to hit the right target demographic. What do you like about watch stories and watch communication? Do you prefer images? Do you prefer text specs? Do you prefer blow apart diagrams? Do you prefer lists of materials? I mean, what is it that really speaks to you? You say you don't feel spoken to very much. I'm sure it's possible to speak to you. You've certainly got a self-starting personality that has led you to dig into every rabbit hole the internet has to offer to find out more about your date just. So it's not like you're lazy. It's not like you want to be told everything and then go out and buy it like a blind zombie. What would work on you? What do you want to see from brands?
Well, something that I think is most poignant about vintage watches is that there's often a story associated with those watches, right? I think the biggest issue today is that it feels like most people, if you see people wearing a watch and they are sort of a public figure, I feel like usually they are paid to do that. I think that takes a lot away from that. Whereas back in the day, if you saw guys in the military wearing a Submariner, you thought, wow, it's a tough watch, probably can handle all the things that I would do at the beach with it. I think that's much more charming, it comes much more naturally. And that is something that I feel like is why I like IWC so much in a way. Not because of what they do with Formula One, I don't really care. But probably one of the best pieces of marketing I've seen about from IWC is the Houdinki video where they look at the new Small Big Pilot. And it's not about the Small Big Pilot, but the pilot was already wearing a doppelchronograph from IWC. I think that's just fantastic, right? I didn't really care about the new Small Big Pilot in that video. The coolest thing I thought was that this pilot was actually using this watch. Actually bought it for that reason. So I suppose like connecting it to a story, and I just said like, it's incredible. But connecting it to a story that is real, not that it's completely fabricated for the masses to consume.
So you're saying, really, to be frank, you can't synthesize those stories. It's the genuineness that really speaks to you. And so brands need to either look for real-world ambassadors, focus on that more, or be very clever. Perhaps IWC were even this clever to strap a special chronograph of their own from the past on the wrist of a pilot that was featuring in a new marketing tool for a brand new watch. I mean, now you've mentioned it, that's pretty smart. Brands should take note there. Synthesize your own heritage. We always say, like, you can't fake the heritage. And that's kind of the problem when it comes to, like, for example, Tudor releasing a watch, like a Black Bay, which really recalls an old Rolex. But it's not an old Rolex, it's a new Tudor. It's not an old Tudor, it's a new Tudor. And so it has this kind of shallowness to it. It doesn't have that same appeal. But I wonder if I'm sure there's something that a brand could take from that commentary, that you're really interested in the realistic life of a watch, what it's been put through, what it can survive, what it can stand up to. So are there like collaborations, for example, maybe with a space agency? Fortis is working with, they were working with Roscosmos years ago. Now they're working with the Swedish Space Corporation, actually trying to create watches for deep space travel. That kind of thing, does that kind of thing appeal to you?
Well, I suppose the problem with that is that these days, if you want to sell a mechanical watch, it's very difficult to sort of connect that to a real world application. Because I suppose if people go into space now, they wouldn't wear a mechanical watch. They would wear a quartz watch, right? Because it's got more features.
Are you sure about that? Because we don't believe that's necessarily the case. If we're talking deep space, flying to Mars, long journeys, months or years in space, having a battery-powered watch is not the wisest idea. Having a mechanical watch would make sense, at least as a fail-safe, at least have something running in the background. Most divers these days dive with dive computers, right? They don't all dive with just a Rolex Submariner, but a lot of divers do still wear a mechanical watch as a backup. So, there is a purpose for it, is there not?
I suppose so, yes. But it depends on how far out it is, right? How far away deep space travel is. I would assume that, especially if you're in space already, you might just wear something that's solar powered, and you have backup batteries that you maybe could swap in if one of the other ones dies, right? But you could have a mechanical one, certainly, yes. Um, I suppose it's harder to market it like that, and especially if it's not already being used. That's sort of the argument I made earlier. The problem with that is you can't really market a new watch like that, because obviously if it's a new watch, it's not been worn yet, so that doesn't work. So it would be delayed by a couple of years. You could only really advertise old watches like that, unless they're actively being used somewhere. And I think it's admirable if brands have this sort of commitment to try and move forward. I mean, developing a watch for deep space, I suppose that is going to be might make for a technological advancement, but I'm not so sure if that is really the way to go in my eyes, right? Maybe I'm sort of stuck in the past. I suppose that might be the case.
Well, I think we all are to a certain extent, mate. I wouldn't worry about that. But I think you do make a good point, especially saying you can't really advertise a new watch in a way that appeals to you, or what appeals to you about watches can't really be communicated with a new watch, because it has to be battle tested or field tested at least. So yeah, very, very good point. When you were researching the Rolex Datejusts from the past and other things that you've looked into, did you find that there was a sudden point in history where documentation just seemed to disappear? Like there was no records of anything left because random references were often cobbled together. There could have been spare dials thrown into watches and sent out to retailers, because nobody looked at watchmaking in the same way that we look at it now as like this collector's hobby. They looked at it as just the supply of a good quality object. And there could well be many white sharks out there, great white sharks. I think that's one of the Rolex, isn't it? The GMT with a white dial. Does it exist? Does it not exist? Nobody really knows if any of these ever made it out, or if any of the dials that people have seen were real or aftermarket. Did you find that there's a point in history where you just can never really be sure, pre-quartz crisis perhaps?
The thing is, most of my research that goes far back has been with Rolex, and Rolex is such a big thing. There's a lot of documentation about it from the community. But the issue with, as you mentioned, the white sharks, the blueberries, and so on, and the albinos, it's just that Rolex doesn't say whether or not they made them or not, right? If you go to Patek, there's I forgot which collector it was from, but the story was that he had a watch. The watch got damaged, so they used the same movement, I believe, put it into a new case and made its own reference for that, and they would confirm that later on. So I think it really depends what it is that you really refer to, right? If it's a very particular thing about a movement that's not been used in a long time, I'd imagine that would be very difficult and hard to come by, just because there's no use to have kept it around for the past 40 years. But with watches that people are interested in, if there's any sort of communication from the brand, just to sort of give a general idea of what might be real or what might not be real. I suppose in my research, there's not been too many huge gaps, right? But I suppose, as I mentioned, I don't know if my date just could have been real, right? Maybe it was a very small run, or maybe somebody really wanted it that way. Who knows, right? I couldn't know, but that's really the only gaps like that I found, but nothing else really.
I have a horrible question for you. Okay, it's really horrible. It's probably unanswerable, but I would really like to hear your thoughts on it. And the title of the question, because it could probably have a whole paper written to it to accurately ask it, is what is real? Now, let me give you an example. You mentioned Franken watches before. You know exactly what a Franken watch is, and the Franken watch can be multiple things, I guess. It could either be a watch made of fake parts to resemble an existing watch with one or two real components within it, either a case or a dial or even a movement, for example. Or it could be a watch made with entirely genuine components, but in a configuration that was never officially released by the brand. So here's an example. You've got a hypothetical example. You've got a limited run of Rolex Submariners, okay? Rolex is going to make 100 of these Submariners. And they make 100 and they send them out to their retailers and they're all sold before they even arrive at the retailers. Now, there's one Rolex watchmaker and he's been assembling these Submariners. And over time, certain parts have come across his desk that didn't quite pass QC. Maybe there's a nick on a lug, or there's a slight mark on a bezel, or there's a blemish on a dial, or a slight dead spot on the loom of a hand, etc., etc. But this watchmaker is very diligent and he realizes these are not cheap parts. They shouldn't just go in the bin. Perhaps officially they should go back to be crushed and the material repurposed for something else. But he puts them in his drawer just in case at some point in the future, one of these 100 Rolex Submariners comes back to the office and he's charged with repairing it. And he thinks, oh, you know what? I've got a hand that I can use here because we don't have any of these left in stock. I'm going to use this hand instead. Anyway, time goes on. The watchmaker's sitting there and he's got a whole watch's worth of parts in his bench. And for some reason, couldn't imagine why, he becomes disgruntled with Rolex management and he decides he's going to leave and he's going to go work for Richard Mille. I don't know why he decides to work for Richard Mille. He's an odd chap. But he takes all the components out of his bench and he says, I'm going to give myself a little parting gift because I haven't earned enough money to buy myself a Rolex Submariner. I'm going to make the 101st one of these Rolex Submariners. And so he assembles all of the bits. Every single bit is an official Rolex component. It is exactly the right component for the watches that made it out to retail. Now, you could say, okay, one or two bits may be a little bit scratched or a little bit duffed up here or there or everywhere, but once it's on the wrist, it's not going to make any damn bit of difference. As soon as he's had it out of the workshop for 5 minutes, it'll look exactly the same as any other Rolex. So he assembles this watch, and he puts it on his wrist, and he takes it home, quits Rolex, he goes and works for Richard Mille, probably does the same thing there because he's realized it's a great way to get a free watch. And he dies suddenly at his desk. I don't know of what, probably boredom. And his son takes this watch and he looks at it and he goes, oh, Dad had this amazing Rolex Submariner. This is one of the 100 pieces that was limited a couple of years ago. He looks at it and he realizes that there's no serial number on the back because that's the one thing that's different from this watch and all the other watches out in the market. My question to you, after that surprisingly detailed story that just came out of my head, is that a real Rolex? Discuss.
Well, so I'd like to start off with Franken watches. So I suppose my definition might not match the one that's officially used, but I see a Franken watch as being all original parts, but the pieces, the parts don't belong into that particular watch. Otherwise, it's like, I suppose you could say it's custom. So I suppose a Franken watch is still all original, just not put together in the way that it would have been intended by the brand. So I suppose with that Rolex, I would probably say that it is one, right? I mean, the way you put your story, he would have probably put it together around the time he worked at Rolex. And it's all Rolex parts made by Rolex employees. I suppose that is a Rolex. And I would argue that it's probably more interesting than the other 100, right? Because it was made by one person for himself. Because I'm not sure, depending on how far back you go, I'd imagine the other Rolexes aren't made by one person. So if this, well, I mean, the parts put together, but if you refined them because they were damaged, it's more made by one person than the other watches would have been. For me, that is a lot more interesting. But then again, I already pointed out how to me stories are very important. So the 101st one without the serial on it, I believe people would find that to be more interesting.
That is interesting that you say that, and I am somewhat in agreement with you. And yeah, I think I mean your definition of Frankenwatch, I think is yeah, I agree with that. Also, I think that there's probably some flexibility in that, but yeah, absolutely genuine parts put together in a configuration that previously didn't exist. The example here, the 101st limited Rolex Submariner, is exactly the same. Effectively, you can discount the damage. That's my justification for why he's got the pieces rather than just making him an out and out thief. He could just be a thief. You could just say he stole spare parts from the workshop and put it together. And the reason why I ask is because watchmaking has become so much more about context than it ever was in the past. If you had this scenario in 1978, I don't think there'd be anybody on planet Earth that would turn around and try and tell you that's not a real Rolex, because it mattered so much less than it does now what a watch is part of. You know, it goes to people wanting piece uniques much more now than well, not that they ever did. They probably wanted piece uniques in the 1700s and the 1800s more than they did in the 1900s. And now we're back into this sort of era of self-expression where people want something special. It's why brands like Artisan de Genève exist, I suppose, so people can take their Rolexes and have them pimped out however they want them. Bamford made a lot of hay with that in the early days of Bamford Watch Department as well. It's interesting because this is a watch, the watch I'm describing, the hypothetical watch. I haven't got one of these imaginary submariners, in case you're wondering if I'm asking for your advice. But this watch is a Rolex, and it's made by a Rolex watchmaker in the Rolex facility with Rolex tools, to Rolex standards. It simply does not have a serial number, paperwork, and it is not in the system. Now, I agree that that's interesting, and that's kind of cool, and that's a story that you could tell somebody. But it is also true simultaneously that some people would see that and say, that's not a real Rolex, simply because it wasn't distributed through Rolex's channels officially. It's off the back of a lorry, almost literally in this case. So I agree with you, I think. Certainly would be interesting to find that. It would be even more interesting if the watchmaker in question, of course, unfortunately, he died at his desk at Richard Mille in this story, but if he'd gone on to great things and started his own brand and then later on came out and said, oh, I did this, I made this watch, and perhaps he sold it at some point while he was trying to fund his new brand that's out there in the world, people would go nuts trying to find it, the unserialized version of this watch. But I did just want your opinion on that, because it's a question, a discussion we have frequently, not often on air, in fact, never on air, because it's difficult to come down with a hard and fast answer, although you did a pretty good job of sounding convincing. But we like to chew over the concepts behind it, like what makes a watch genuine. It's not just its parts, because a Franken watch, as you describe it, could account for really many watches that were put out into retailers with like the wrong handset. That would be a Franken watch, right? If you had like a pre-Daytona Cosmograph, or pre-Cosmograph Daytona, I always get it the wrong way around, with just a random, I still don't know what it is, still with a random handset on it that fits, and it's Rolex, and it's not bodged together, it's just the wrong handset, or like a Speedmaster with alpha hands from the FOIS on a regular moon watch. Is it not a genuine Omega? Yeah, it is, but it doesn't match up with the bookkeeping. So that's why I was interested, because those things that we describe as Franken watches existed legitimately at one point, and then they became something that people have manipulated for monetary gain later on, and something collectors like you desperately want to avoid. But yeah, interesting discussion. Any more comments on that before I ask you a final question?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I have something to add about that. I should specify that when I talk about Franken watches, I refer to them mostly about as something that was made after the fact, right? If it came out the factory that way, I wouldn't really call it a Franken watch. It certainly is something different, but it's not really a Franken watch in that sense, I would think.
Yeah, fair point as well. I guess you could apply it very strictly to something that was modified after the fact. But then again, the definition really does extend to anything that isn't catalog appropriate, right? I mean, it might be sanctioned by the brand, which is even weirder, which makes it the prospect of looking back on the mid-20th century watchmaking and the brands that existed then. They were doing all sorts of stuff. Like, they were just flinging out watches to sell to people because they never expected that guys like you and I would be trawling through their records 70 years later going, oh, I don't believe that handset matches with that dial printing, or this is the original look. They never would have seen that coming, ever. It's completely preposterous. The guys that put those watches together, the official Franken watches, if we want to give them a different name to distinguish them from the ones you're describing quite rightly, they probably would have worked up until the quartz crisis and lost their jobs through that period and thought, well, that's the end of mechanical watchmaking. Forget it. They would never have been able to predict the resurgence of mechanical watchmaking as it is. And that's a lovely segue into the last question I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to let you go because I know you're a busy man. Independent watchmaking. Today, looking ahead, which brands have caught your eye and why?
Well, so I am very fortunate to know somebody who's quite well connected. So what I find to be most interesting, or I suppose that there's two categories really. One that is really just pushing the boundaries, and one that is doing something in a way that is more affordable, right? So I talked about Habring before. I think their stuff is fantastic. And I think Kudoke is fantastic. But they are very, very much very different from a brand like Vutilainen or from FP Journe, for instance, right? And there's a lot of smaller ones whose name I've unfortunately forgotten, but lovely people behind them, really interesting things. I suppose the only thing I really worry about with that is that it stays this very, very exclusive thing that is completely inaccessible unless you already have connections in that sort of sphere. Speaking of the higher end, right? That is something that I sort of worry. But then again, there's great things coming out and really interesting pieces being made. I suppose it's a bit in a way how vintage watches are. There's this one guy that makes a watch, and then it's this big thing because he only has one of them, and he makes one that is slightly different, but not quite a different watch entirely, but it's a different movement. Watch but generally, a layman would say it's the same watch, but it's this huge thing because comes from this one workshop in a way. So the only thing I worry is that it gets too commercialized. So if all of these brands get huge, I think they lose a bit of their allure.
Well, I don't think you've got too much to worry about there because there'll always be new brands willing to pop up and do exciting things with the field of watchmaking, which is, as we know, now extremely expansive. Simon, thank you for taking the time to sit down with me. Thanks for your patience for finding a date at which we could both record. And I've really enjoyed this episode. It went in directions I was not expecting, and your insights are valuable to me, and I'm sure to the community. If any of our network have questions for Simon, then please feel free to get in touch via the usual channels. You can do so by contacting us via our dedicated Instagram handle at therealtime.show, or you can find me at Rob Nuds, that's ROBNUDDS. On Instagram, my regular co-host Alon Ben Joseph can be found at ALONBENJOSEPH, and our resident provocateur David Vaucher can be found at DAVAUCHER. You can email either Alon or me at Rob or Alon at therealtime.show, or contact us via the contact form on the website www.therealtime.show. We'll be back soon with more top quality watch content. Until then, stay safe and keep on ticking.